I thought this summer would be simple. Early mornings, long days helping on the farm, and quiet evenings watching the sunset. What I didn't expect was how much everything would change, starting with the way my Aunt Mabel looked at me one night. The gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled into the long driveway leading up to my aunt and uncle's farmhouse. The house stood against the golden backdrop of endless fields, its white paint weathered but charming. It had been years since I'd last been here, but the memories came flooding back. The smell of hay, the sound of cows in the distance, and Aunt Mabel's warm laugh echoing from the porch. She was there now, waiting for me. Mabel was 70, but you wouldn't know it from the way she carried herself. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her sun-weathered face had the kind of warmth that made you feel at home instantly. She waved as I stepped out of the car. "Well, look who's finally decided to visit," she teased, pulling me into a firm hug. "It's been too long, James." "Good to see you, Aunt Mabel," I said, smiling. Uncle Roy wasn't far behind, his frame still sturdy despite his advancing years. He shook my hand with a grip that reminded me he'd been working these fields his whole life. "Glad to have you here, son," he said. "There's plenty of work to keep you busy." The first few days fell into a predictable rhythm. Early mornings feeding the animals, afternoons repairing fences or clearing out the barn, and evenings spent around the dinner table, the three of us sharing stories and laughing over Mabel's cooking. Mabel was the heart of the farm. She managed everything with a precision and energy that amazed me. Roy, on the other hand, seemed content to spend most of his time supervising or napping in his chair on the porch. "You're doing great, kid," Mabel said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "Roy's always been good at ordering people around, but it's nice to have someone here who actually gets things done." I laughed, but there was something in her tone, a warmth, a softness, that caught me off guard. I brushed it off, chalking it up to her gratitude for the extra help. One particularly hot afternoon, I was out in the field mending a broken fence. The sun was relentless, and I was drenched in sweat by the time Mabel appeared, carrying a pitcher of lemonade. "Thought you could use a break," she said, handing me a glass. "Thanks," I said, taking a long sip. She watched me for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "You've grown into quite the man," she said, her tone almost wistful. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just smiled. "Well, I had good role models." She laughed, shaking her head. "Flatterer." As she turned to leave, her hand brushed against my arm, lingering just a second longer than necessary. It was such a small thing, but it left me standing there, feeling something I couldn't quite put into words. That night, Roy retired to bed early, leaving Mabel and me alone in the living room. She poured herself a glass of wine and offered me one as well. "Don't tell Roy," she said with a wink. "He thinks I'm too old for this stuff." I laughed, taking the glass. "Your secret's safe with me." We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing. She told me stories about her youth, about the farm, and about how things had changed over the years. I told her about college, my plans for the future, and how lost I'd felt since graduating. "You'll figure it out," she said softly, her hand resting on mine. "You're a good man, James. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her touch was comforting, but there was something else in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, about the way her hand had lingered, the way she'd looked at me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But then there were the other moments. The way her laughter seemed softer when we were alone, the way she found reasons to stand closer to me, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to me, her expression serious. "Thank you for being here," she said quietly. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to talk to like this." "Of course," I said, my chest tightening. "I'm happy to help." She smiled, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made my heart race. It happened later that night. I was in the barn, putting away tools, when Mabel appeared in the doorway. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, her voice soft. "Just finishing up," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. She stepped closer, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the barn light. "You work too hard," she said, her tone teasing but kind. I laughed nervously. "Just trying to keep up with you." She smiled, her gaze holding mine for a moment longer than it should have. And then, before I could process what was happening, she reached out, her hand brushing against my cheek. "You're a good man, James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding as the air between us seemed to crackle with tension. For a moment, neither of us moved, the world around us fading into the background. Then she stepped back, her cheeks flushing. "I should go," she said quickly, turning toward the door. "Good night, Mabel," I said, my voice shaky. "Good night," she whispered, disappearing into the night. As I stood there alone in the barn, my mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Mabel greeted me with her usual warm smile, serving breakfast as though nothing had happened the night before. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way her hand had lingered on my cheek, the softness in her voice when she said my name. "Eat up," she said, placing a plate of eggs and bacon in front of me. "We got a busy day ahead." "Thanks," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was anything but. Roy was already outside, tending to the animals. He hadn't noticed the shift in the air between Mabel and me, but I felt it with every passing glance, every accidental touch. The sun beat down as we worked together in the field, repairing an old fence that had been damaged in the last storm. Mabel had tied her hair back, her sleeves rolled up as she worked beside me. "You're a natural at this," she said, handing me a hammer. "Thanks," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. We worked in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the distant mooing of cows and the occasional creak of the fence. But then she stopped, leaning against the post and looking out at the horizon. "Do you ever think about leaving it all behind?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet. I looked at her surprised. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her gaze distant. "This farm, this life. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if I'd chosen a different path." "You love this place," I said. "Don't you?" "I do," she said, smiling faintly. "But love doesn't mean it's always easy. And sometimes it feels lonely." The vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard, and before I could think better of it, I reached out, my hand brushing against hers. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "James!" Roy's voice boomed from the barn, breaking the spell. Mabel pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. "You should go see what he needs," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her emotions. "Yeah," I said, my throat tight. As I walked toward the barn, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed an invisible line, one that couldn't be undone. That night, Roy fell asleep early, leaving Mabel and me alone in the living room. She poured herself a glass of wine, offering me one as well. "To a hard day's work," she said, raising her glass. "To not breaking the fence again," I joked, earning a laugh from her. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the tension between us simmering just beneath the surface. "You've been a big help around here," she said suddenly, her tone serious. "I'm glad I could help," I said, looking at her. She met my gaze, her eyes soft. "You remind me a lot of Roy when he was your age," she said. "Strong, capable, but kinder somehow." Her words sent a jolt through me, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, her hand resting lightly on mine. "You're a good man, James." The air between us grew heavy, and for a moment, I thought she might say something more. But then she stood, taking her glass with her. "Good night," she said softly, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The next day, as we worked together in the barn, Roy appeared in the doorway, his gaze sharp. "What's taking so long?" he asked, his tone gruff. "Just finishing up," Mabel said quickly, stepping away from me. Roy's eyes lingered on us for a moment, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. But then he grunted and walked away, leaving us in tense silence. Mabel let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a pitchfork. "We need to be more careful," she said quietly. "I know," I said, my voice low. "I'm sorry." "It's not your fault," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "This is complicated." That evening, As the sun set over the fields, Mabel and I found ourselves alone on the porch. The golden light bathed the landscape in warmth, but the tension between us was cold and sharp. "James," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I need you to understand something." "What?" I asked, my chest tightening. "This isn't fair to you," she said, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "You're young, with your whole life ahead of you. Emmy, you're amazing," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You're the most incredible person I've ever met." She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You don't mean that?" "I do," I said, stepping closer. "And you know it." For a moment, neither of us moved, the space between us crackling with unspoken emotions. Then slowly she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. "This is wrong," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "I don't care," I said, my voice breaking. And then, before either of us could think better of it, the distance between us disappeared. The kiss was hesitant at first, as though we were both waiting for the other to pull away. But when neither of us did, it deepened, and the weight of everything else fell away. There was only the warmth of her touch, the softness of her lips, and the way her hand trembled slightly as she reached up to cup my face. But then, just as quickly as it began, she pulled back, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't, this isn't." "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her hands trembling. "This is wrong. Roy's barely here," I finished for her, my voice filled with frustration. "You deserve more than that, Mabel. You deserve someone who actually sees you." She shook her head, her expression torn. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't just about me. It's about us, about what this will do to you." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "I don't care about the consequences," I said, my voice steady. "I care about you." For a moment, she didn't say anything, her eyes searching mine. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. "I don't know how to stop this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither did I. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments and quiet touches. We were careful, too careful, avoiding anything that might arouse Roy's suspicion. But every glance, every accidental touch, felt charged with a tension that neither of us could deny. One evening, as we worked together in the barn, she turned to me, her expression serious. "We can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "I know," I said, though my chest tightened at the thought. She looked away, her hands twisting nervously. "It's not fair to Roy. Or to you." "It's not fair to you either," I said, my voice firm. "You deserve to be happy, Mabel." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me, her expression pained. "Happiness isn't always an option," she said softly. It was a warm afternoon, and we were working together in the garden when Roy appeared unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway of the house, his gaze sharp as he watched us. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his tone gruff. "Just pulling weeds," Mabel said quickly, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Roy didn't respond right away, his eyes narrowing as he looked between us. "You've been spending a lot of time together," he said finally, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. Mabel forced a laugh. "Well, there's a lot of work to be done," she said. "And James has been a big help." Roy grunted, his expression unreadable. "Just make sure you don't wear him out," he said before turning and heading back inside. As soon as he was out of earshot, Mabel let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "We need to be more careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I said, though the knot in my stomach told me it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. That evening, after Roy had gone to bed, Mabel and I found ourselves alone in the living room. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling as she took a sip. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice heavy. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we just stopped pretending?" "All the time," I said, my voice breaking. "But I don't know how to stop." Her breath hitched, and she set her glass down, her hands trembling. "James, I care about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should. But this can't end well." "I don't care about the ending," I said, stepping closer. "I care about you." For a moment, neither of us moved, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. "This is dangerous," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "So is pretending," I said, my voice firm. The following days felt like walking a tightrope. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word was a risk, and yet we couldn't seem to stop. The tension between us was unbearable, and the fear of being discovered only made it worse. Roy, for his part, seemed oblivious, at least for now. But the guilt that weighed on Mabel was impossible to ignore. "We're playing with fire," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, the sun setting in the distance. "Maybe," I said, my voice soft. "But some things are worth the risk." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I hope you're right," she whispered. "It happened one night, when Roy went to town for a late meeting. Mabel and I were alone in the house, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I can't keep doing this," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Neither can I admitted, my chest tightening. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "Then what do we do?" "I don't know," I said, my voice breaking. "But I know I don't want to lose you." For a moment, neither of us moved, the weight of our emotions pressing down on us. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch mine. And just like that, the line we'd been walking disappeared entirely. The first time felt like an inevitability, a storm that had been building for weeks. But in the days that followed, the reality of what we'd done began to sink in. Mabel avoided me in the mornings, her demeanor tense and cautious, as if proximity alone might unravel the fragile balance we'd managed to keep. Roy remained oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before he began to notice the cracks. Every glance from him felt sharper, every question weighted with suspicion. Mabel and I still worked together during the day, but the closeness we'd shared was strained now, layered with guilt and the fear of discovery. One afternoon, as we repaired a broken section of the barn roof, she finally spoke. "This has to stop," she said, her voice low but firm. I looked at her, my chest tightening. "What are you saying?" She sighed, setting down the hammer in her hands. "We can't keep doing this, James. It's not fair to Roy. Or to you." "And what about you?" I asked, my voice soft. "Is this fair to you?" She hesitated, her expression torn. "This isn't about what's fair. It's about what's right." I wanted to argue, to tell her that what we had was worth the risk. But the look in her eyes stopped me. She was scared of what we'd done, of what might happen if we were caught, and of what it would mean for both of us. That evening, Roy joined us for dinner, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something more subdued. He didn't say much, his eyes flicking between Mabel and me as we ate in tense silence. "You've been quiet lately," he said suddenly, his gaze fixed on Mabel. "Everything all right?" "Of course," she replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And you, James? Settling in okay?" "Yeah," I said, my throat tight. "Everything's great." Roy didn't respond, but the weight of his gaze lingered, and I couldn't help but feel like he was beginning to put the pieces together. A few days later, as I worked in the barn, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Turning, I found Roy standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure," I said, setting down the shovel in my hands. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mabel," he said, his tone casual but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "She's been showing me the ropes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Roy nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "She talks about you a lot, you know. Says you've been a big help around here." "I'm just doing what I can," I said, my palms beginning to sweat. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his eyes boring into mine. Then he nodded again, clapping me on the shoulder. "Keep up the good work," he said before turning and walking away. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mabel and I found ourselves alone in the living room. Roy had gone into town for a late meeting, leaving the house unusually quiet. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, my chest tightening. "I know." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "This has gotten out of hand," she said quietly. "We're going to get caught if we're not careful." "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "But I do know that I'm scared. For you, for me, for everything." I reached out, my hand brushing against hers. "Mabel, Before I could finish, the sound of the front door opening sent a jolt of panic through both of us. "Mabel?" Roy's voice called from the hallway. She sprang to her feet, stepping away from me quickly. "In here," she called, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Roy appeared in the doorway, his gaze flicking between us. "What are you two up to?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just talking," Mabel said quickly, her smile forced. Roy didn't respond, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, don't stay up too late," he said before disappearing up the stairs. As soon as he was out of earshot, Mabel let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "This has to stop," she said firmly, her voice breaking. But as I looked at her, the fear and longing in her eyes told me that neither of us was ready to let go. The days that followed were tense, the weight of our secret pressing down on both of us. Roy's questions became more pointed, his gaze sharper, and it was clear that he was beginning to suspect something. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, he turned to me suddenly. "So, James," he said, his tone casual, "what are your plans after the summer?" I hesitated, caught off guard. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "I'm still figuring things out." Roy nodded slowly, his gaze flicking to Mabel. "You've been a big help around here," he said. "Almost makes me wonder if you're planning to stick around." Mabel forced a laugh, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her glass of water. "Don't be silly," she said quickly. "James has his whole life ahead of him." Roy didn't respond, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before turning back to me. "Well, just don't get too comfortable," he said, his tone light, but his words heavy with meaning. It was a quiet night, and the house felt heavy with unspoken tension. Roy had gone to bed early, his presence looming even in his absence. Mabel and I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. "We can't keep doing this," Mabel said quietly, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I know," I replied, though the thought of stopping felt like tearing a piece of myself away. "But what's the alternative? Pretend like nothing's happened?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if Roy finds out—" The fear in her voice was palpable, and it made my chest tighten. "He won't," I said firmly, though the knot in my stomach told me it was only a matter of time. The next day, Roy left for town to handle some errands, leaving Mabel and me alone. We worked together in the barn, the silence between us thick with tension. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Do what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This," she said, gesturing between us. "Sneaking around, lying, it's tearing me apart." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "We just need more time." But before she could respond, we heard the sound of the truck pulling up outside. Roy wasn't supposed to be back yet. "James," his voice called from the yard. Panic shot through me, and I stepped back quickly, putting as much distance between us as possible. Mabel's face was pale as she turned toward the door. "Stay calm," she whispered, her voice shaking. Roy walked into the barn, his eyes scanning the room. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Just fixing up the tools," Mabel said quickly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Roy's gaze flicked to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," he said. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "There's a lot of work to do," I said. He nodded slowly, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach churn. "You're a hard worker, James. I'll give you that," he said, his tone casual but his words heavy with meaning. Mabel forced a laugh, stepping between us. He's been a huge help, she said, her voice light. We couldn't have managed without him. Roy didn't respond, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he turned and walked out of the barn. As soon as he was gone, Mabel let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. This is getting too dangerous, she said quietly. I nodded, my chest tight with fear. I know. That evening, after Roy had gone to bed, Mabel and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards as we moved. I can't keep doing this, she said suddenly, her voice breaking. Neither can I admitted, my heart pounding. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. Then what do we do? I don't know, I said, stepping closer. But I know I don't want to lose you. Her breath hitched, and she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. This is madness, she whispered, though she didn't pull away. Maybe, I said, my voice soft. But it's real. For a moment, neither of us moved, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. And then, just as I leaned in, we heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Mabel stepped back quickly, her face pale as Roy appeared in the doorway. What's going on in here? He asked, his tone sharp. Nothing, Mabel said quickly, her voice trembling. Just cleaning up? Roy's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, his gaze flicking between us. You think I'm stupid? He asked, his voice rising. Roy, Mabel began, but he cut her off. Don't, he said sharply, his face red with anger. Don't lie to me. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Roy barely spoke to either of us, his presence a constant reminder of the storm that was brewing. Mabel tried to act as though everything was normal, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. Then one evening, Roy confronted me directly. You need to leave, he said, his voice cold. What? I asked, my heart sinking. You heard me, he said, his eyes narrowing. I don't know what's going on between you and Mabel, but I'm not going to let it ruin this family. I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand, cutting me off. Pack your things, he said, and don't come back. The next morning, I packed my bags, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. Mabel didn't say much, her eyes filled with tears as she watched me load my things into the car. I'm sorry, I said, my voice breaking. It's not your fault, she said quietly. But maybe this is for the best. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. Goodbye, Mabel. Goodbye, James, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As I drove away, the farmhouse fading into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a part of myself behind.